Hello and welcome to our part 2 video on the Romantic period. We are going to be addressing chapter 9, which is on program music, as well as chapter 11, which is on nationalism, which will also include exoticism in with that, because exoticism is kind of the antithesis of nationalism. It's sort of the opposite of it. So we'll be talking about that too. If you recall, way back in I believe it's chapter 1, it mentioned these two items, which is why we're kind of skipping around in our first section. So I don't go sequentially all the way through these chapters, since chapter 1 does address program music as a kind of a strong attribute of the Romantic period, as well as nationalism and exoticism. We're going to include those chapters. And as you can see, they're relatively short chapters. Chapter 11 may look a little longer, but it does have a rather involved listing outline for an example of nationalism. Okay, so the idea of program music. Before we dive fully into that, let's talk about what isn't program music, because most of the music we've covered up to this point falls under the category of what we call absolute music. Absolute music is instrumental music having no intended association with a story, poem, idea, or scene. And therefore program music is the opposite of that. Program music does have a specific story or idea or poem. It's meant to be associated with something else. So when you listen to program music, you're not supposed to just allow your imagination just to go wherever and think about whatever you want to. There is a specific thing that the composer originally had in mind. So we are going to be looking at a few famous examples of this, and you will see that all of the examples I give you, the composer intended for something very specific to be evoked by the music. So we kind of do this naturally in today's world because, of course, one of the easiest ways we hear orchestral music nowadays is through video games and movies and stuff like that. And of course, that music isn't written independently usually of those mediums. They are designed to be to evoke, the images, thoughts, and feelings of the movie or something. So, for instance, if you go bum bum ba da bum 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 bum, you probably immediately think of like Harry Potter. So, we're kind of used to the idea of musical ideas being associated with objects or places or characters or something like that, because it's kind of in our pop culture. And speaking of which, program music almost always utilizes themes like that, much like most movie music does. You're going to notice that quite a few pieces of program music do use specific musical ideas. We're going to look at the 1812 Overture here in a little bit and see how Tchaikovsky used not just themes to represent things going on in the story that he's representing in that, but he actually uses themes that his audience would have been aware of, like traditional Russian music and the French national anthem and things like that. All right, so we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, let's remind you of what program music is. It's music that is meant to evoke a specific image or thought or emotion or whatever, and the composer specifies that. It's probably where we get the name program in program music. If you've ever been to a concert where they perform like concert music, like anywhere from a middle school band concert to like the North Carolina Symphony performing or something, they probably gave you a program which included information in that program, including like what they were going to play, maybe a little information about the pieces. Well, in the program itself, back in the 1800s, they would often tell the story or give you a summary of the play or whatever that inspired this piece of music. And even though we mentioned in our last video that the Romantics were not big on forms, forms dealt with a rational approach to music and that age of reason, that classical period of Mozart and Haydn and stuff like that, that classical approach to composing where everything kind of had to have a reason and logic behind it, and formal structure was a big thing. We're now in the Romantic period, where it's very much a rebellion against the predominantly German school of composing, the Viennese school of composing, where you have this logical structure assigned to music. And We are going to see some new forms develop, but these forms are usually very loosely built. They're not as strict, and you will see that these forms are mostly based on classical forms, but a sort of liberation of these classical forms. You will notice, for instance, the word symphony used here, which symphony was, it reached its height of popularity and sort of became a organized form in the classical period. You have now a program symphony, which is the general idea of a symphony, which is a piece, extended work for orchestra that's divided into movements. But unlike the classical symphony, this one is actually divided into really as many movements as you need, as the story requires. And there usually is a story attached to it. Our example here, which will be by a French composer named Hector Berlioz, you get a chapter on him right after this one. Hector Berlioz was a French composer, and he wrote this symphony, and the French name of it is Symphonie Fantastique, or Fantastic Symphony. Now, Berlioz wasn't being overly egotistical by calling it a fantastic symphony. The word fantastic, as we use it today to mean like to be something that is really wonderful, that is not really the connotation it carried in his title. If you look at the word fantastic, it looks a lot like the word fantasy, and that's because fantastic means it is supposed to be fantasy. So it's really a fantasy symphony. It's about actually a dream that someone has, a character that actually represents Berlioz in real life. See, Berlioz fell madly in love with this actress, but she wouldn't go out with him, so he wrote this piece of music to impress her. And he actually ended up creating characters in the story behind the symphony that would have, again, been included in the program. The audience would have been able to read this story while they listened to the music. And you can see the movements are even named, not like minuet and trio or scherzo or rondo. You'll see the movements are actually descriptive titles of the various events that happen in the story. But in this story, Berlioz is represented by this young man, and this young man actually overdoses on opium, which is, of course, where we get like heroin and stuff like that. There were actual opium dens present in the 1800s in places like London and even here in America and stuff like that. So, people were abusing drugs long before the 20th and 21st century. And this guy, distraught over this girl not returning his love, ends up overdosing on opium, and he has this fantastic dream, and this dream is represented in the story. So that's what a good example of a programmed symphony is, and you will more than likely be required to listen to at least the March to the Scaffold, which is probably the most famous part of this particular symphony. So it's not a traditional symphony. It has 5 movements instead of 4, and you'll notice that the movements themselves are not really like strict forms. He may use like the kind of general idea of sonata form to kind of organize his ideas in a movement, but not even the movements themselves are named after the forms. Because again, in the Romantic period, it's not so much about the logical formal structure, it's about the emotions and using your imagination and your individuality. He's calling upon a personal experience here. And by the way, you'll have to read your chapter on Berlioz to learn whether or not Berlioz was successful in wooing this young actress and going out with him, and see what the outcome of that was. All right, so moving on, we're kind of going to wait until we get to the chapter on Berlioz to really listen to that. And again, you might have an actual assigned listening to it, but we'll dive more into that when we cover Berlioz. We'll revisit that. Concert overtures are some of the most performed types of program music that came out of the 1800s. Now, you may recall we used the word overture when discussing opera, because operas usually had an overture or a type of prelude of music that existed before the opera started, and it was usually only played just by the orchestra. Some of these opera overtures became very popular, and again, if you also recall, a lot of the overtures did use sonata form. So concert overtures also use sonata form, although it's usually a much more loose interpretation of sonata form, and some of them don't even really use much sonata form at all. But these concert overtures are mainly in the style of like an operatic overture. But the main thing you need to know about this is there is no opera that follows it. One of the most famous is by Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer, and it's based on the story of Romeo and Juliet. Now, someone may see that it's called the Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture, and they may think that maybe there's an opera called Romeo and Juliet that it's attached to, but the actual answer to that is no, it's not. There is no Romeo and Juliet ballet or opera or nothing that followed it. Tchaikovsky just wrote this concert piece in the style of an operatic overture to express what he felt like were the emotions and kind of, actions and places involved with that story. So it is program music, but please note that just because the word overture is used doesn't mean there's an attached larger piece of work with it. Now, you does mention Mendelssohn's overture called the Hebrides. Hebrides, if you are familiar with that region of the world. Now, I teach over here on the east coast of the United States, so we're over here, and you probably have never heard of the Hebrides before, but they're over here in the United Kingdom, in Scotland. That's the region of the Hebrides. At least what Google Maps is pulling up. I've never been there myself, but Mendelssohn visited, excuse me, I can't talk today, apparently. Mendelssohn visited the Hebrides area in Scotland, and he was so moved by the beauty of the scenery. I mean, just look at this photograph here. I mean, that is just, if you don't take a selfie while visiting there, then you are just crazy. That is just absolutely gorgeous area of the world, and he was really moved by some of the sights and things that he saw there. So he was so inspired, actually, that he ended up writing a concert overture. As you can see here, it's sometimes called Finnegans Cave, but it's mostly known by this. And please pronounce it Hebrides. Don't say Hebrides, as some people do. That's like pronouncing hyperbole as hyperbole. People will judge you based on your pronunciation, and we do try to get it correct on this channel. I probably will mispronounce things from time to time, but I do try to get it correct. Anyway, we're going to listen a little bit to this particular overture here. You can see this is kind of a medium length one coming in at about 10 minutes long, and I think Mendelssohn does a really good job with this. This really is a great example of showing you what a concert overture can do as far as evoking like images and thoughts and feelings. Matter of fact, this almost doesn't even sound like it was written a long time ago. This almost sounds like this could be like opening title music for a movie or something. It immediately creates like this kind of magical sense of mystery and stuff. I imagine that's kind of the emotions he remembered when he thought back on this wonderful, almost magical looking part of the world he visited. So I'm going to shut up for a minute, and I'm going to let you listen to a little bit of this Hebrides overture by Mendelssohn. That's something. I mean, it's just it immediately creates like this sense of mystery and magic, and it beautifully matches this gorgeous scenery from that area of the world. So, that's a pretty typical piece of program music there. It's definitely a great example of a concert overture, because you could see a concert starting that way, just like an operatic overture is meant to kind of pique your interest into what's the story we're going to dive into. It's kind of setting the stage emotionally for the opera. So too, the concert overture might, grab your interest right off the bat. As soon as the conductor brings down his baton, it immediately kind of draws you in. And like we said, they do, for the most part, do use sonata form. They're generally anywhere from about 8 to 15 minutes or so long. some composers, especially towards the end of the 1800s, actually they kept getting longer and longer and longer. And, even some of the pieces are a little long to even be called an overture of types. It's more like an extended work. But for the most part, concert overtures generally are relatively short. Definitely not as long as, say, a programmed symphony or something like that. And they are originally kind of intended to kind of be the prelude to an actual concert of other music. Now, in looking at this next piece of music, the 1812 Overture, now you do see the date, 1812, is included in its name, and some people might be led to believe this is about the War of 1812, but actually it has nothing to do with that particular war. This has to do with Napoleon invading Russia, which is where Tchaikovsky was from. Tchaikovsky wrote this piece to commemorate and celebrate the Russian victory over the French troops. If you recall, Russia at this time was ruled by the Tsar, who is essentially the king, appointed there by God himself to rule over and protect Russia. And that's going to come into play here in a minute, as you will see. Now, first of all, before we listen to the finale part, the ending part of the 1812 Overture, the most famous part, let's kind of familiarize you with a theme that he uses. This is not an original theme by Tchaikovsky. This piece was written before Tchaikovsky included it in the 1812 Overture. And it's La Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. And you've probably heard this before, but just in case you haven't, I'm going to play you the main beginning part that Tchaikovsky quotes to represent the French troops. This is Napoleon's troops. This is the the Grand French Army coming in. And it may seem a little weird that, Tchaikovsky, is kind of painting the enemy, the invaders, the bad guys, if you will, in kind of a glorious light, even using their national anthem in kind of a glorious way. But actually, it's serving the purpose of his story that he's telling. If the French army was a weak army or a miserable army or something like that, like, defeating them is no great feat. So he originally, he kind of builds up the story at the end and presents the French army as this grand, great army because, of course, defeating them, it makes it even sweeter. So here's the French national anthem, just the beginning little part that Tchaikovsky quotes to represent the French. So, let's see if you don't hear Tchaikovsky quote that particular anthem here. There it is one time. You'll notice the strings come in and then they bring it back a little bit higher pitch. And Tchaikovsky continues to build up the quoting of that French national anthem. And then he builds it and builds it and builds it. And one of the things that you must know about the French army under Napoleon, one of its greatest strengths was its artillery, its use of cannon fire. So Tchaikovsky actually calls for cannons to be shot off as the French launched their barrage of cannon fire into the Russian troops. So here, once again, they are presenting the French army as this grand army, this foe to be reckoned with, and you will hear actual cannons be used as the French national anthem blasts out. What Tchaikovsky does for the next part of it is he has this kind of descending figure that the strings play, and that's to represent the first initial charge of the French troops being pushed back by the Russians. So here the Russians are kind of pushing the French back, and you see it goes on quite a bit here to where, and he brings the tempo down too. It's like the the kind of urgency that you heard at the beginning, da 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 da, is now slowed to this like sluggish kind of speed, and that's just the French troops being demoralized as the Russians are pushing them back. And then what you hear next is actually something that the Russian people would be familiar with. As you can see, this is from a collection of Russian choral music, and this is a hymn called "O Lord, Save Thy People," because again, the Tsar is appointed by God to defend Mother Russia, and this is part of their belief that Tchaikovsky probably would have shared at the time, that the Tsar was there to protect Russia, and the Tsar had God's providence on his side, that Napoleon's forces had just marched their way up to Russia's doorstep relatively undefeated, and then here's Russia not really expected to win, and they push them back because God was on their side. So here is this Russian hymn that the Russians would definitely know, and I'm gonna let you listen to that because that's what Tchaikovsky brings in next. Especially that beginning part. I'm going to go back and let you hear it once more. All right, and listen to what Tchaikovsky does here. So there he's using that hymn, "O Lord, Save Thy People." And what he ends up using after that is that it builds up to that for quite some time, and you will notice that it actually hits like kind of the big climatic moment that everybody kind of knows, especially if you've seen V for Vendetta. This is where the explosions start to happen as he conducts, quote unquote, the music. So here it builds up to this part right here. And that theme that you just heard, that's kind of Tchaikovsky's way of representing the Russian forces. So that's kind of their little theme. And he ends up actually playing in counterpoint with that another piece of music here, which is "God Save the Tsar." And I'm going to let you hear a little bit about that, because it's the Russian national anthem. So we've already heard the French national anthem, and now we're hearing the Russian national anthem play underneath. And here's what the Russian national anthem sounds like. So that bum 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 bum, that's the "God Save the Tsar." See if you can hear that played in the lower part of the orchestra as the rest goes ba da ba da ba da ba da ba bum. So there you have Tchaikovsky using some themes, some that he created his own, some that were pre-existing, and the way that he's presenting them helps tell the story that he wants to tell, which is, again, not about the War of 1812, but the battle between Napoleon's army and the Russian forces who pushed them back. Okay. So that is an example of a concert overture. I have one other example, this one also by Tchaikovsky. You may be familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet, which you've probably seen the Shakespeare play or had to read some of it. You know that Romeo and Juliet are from warring families. These families do not like each other at all. Perhaps you maybe even have seen the absolutely wonderful musical West Side Story, which is basically Romeo and Juliet, but set in New York City between rival gangs instead of royal families. And you have these two people that are in love with each other, but it's like the entire universe is trying to tear them apart. They have a forbidden love. And Tchaikovsky was inspired by this story to write a overture. And again, this was not to an actual opera ballet based on the story. This was meant to encapsulate the story within a single piece of music that it was designed to open up a concert. So here's the famous love theme, which is probably the most well-known part of this particular overture. I've isolated it here so we don't have to hunt around for it or whatnot. You may have heard this before. I remember hearing it in, I think, everything from Bugs Bunny cartoons to credit card commercials. It's almost been so used in pop culture that it's almost become humorous to represent anytime anybody madly instantly falls in love with something. But it really is an excellent theme, and it's one of the most beautiful themes that Tchaikovsky ever wrote. You can hear how the melody is like yearning and searching, almost like these two lovers, yearning and searching for each other. They're in pain because they can't be with each other. And yet it also is very beautiful, and it sounds lovely and romantic. It's very lush, maybe a little over top for our 21st century taste. But, Tchaikovsky, you could tell he was really going for the jugular emotionally here. So here is this torrid love theme for Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, I mean, absolutely gorgeous. Maybe it's been perhaps a little overused in pop culture, kind of tainted it a little bit, but I love it. I think it's great. I think it beautifully captures like the story and love, forbidden love between Romeo and Juliet. All right, so that's Concert Overture again, another example of a type of program music that evolved out of the Romantic period. Now, keep in mind the idea of, attaching stories and stuff like that to music isn't original in the Romantic period, but definitely it is the most prolific period for programmatic music. All right, symphonic poem, tone poem. There's two different names here. You do generally see people use the term tone poem a little more often. You may have probably already heard a tone poem and didn't know that you heard a tone poem. You may see here, so spoke Zoroaster, or also sprach Zarathustra, I think is the way you say it, was used in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, which some of you may have seen that film, maybe some of you haven't, but it's the one that goes bom, bom, bom. Well, I'm not singing the right notes, but look it up sometime. Also, sprach Zarathustra, or however you say it. So Spake Zoroaster is the name of it. So spoke. See, I'm just stumbling all over my speech here, and I'm probably already getting some mad comments about my pronunciation there. But I remember, hearing this piece of music. It's the one where the timpani at the end, boom, 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 boom. It's a pretty well-known piece of music. So check that out, see if you've seen it before. Now, the one that I'm going to use as an example is this particular piece written in the late Romantic period by this gentleman here. And you can see the title is called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Now, The Sorcerer's Apprentice was encapsulated into this particular tone poem, which tone poems are similar to concert overtures. They do usually have a story or an idea or poem attached to them. They tend to be a little meatier, though. They tend to use different forms outside of sonata form. They can generally be a little longer, too, in most cases. So Franz Liszt, a composer that you're going to definitely read about in the Romantic period, was essentially the inventor of the tone poem, which is kind of ironic because he's most famous for being a pianist himself. However, he did do a lot of pieces outside of just piano works. He was no stranger to writing for the orchestra and stuff. Now, I've got my Netflix account pulled up here, and if you do have Netflix currently, you can watch both Fantasia, which this is from, as well as Fantasia 2000. And both of them are excellent films. They take classical pieces of music and then they set them to animation. Now, believe it or not, Fantasia, when it came out in the 40s, was very controversial. Some of the animation wasn't, concrete like you see here. It wasn't, representing actual characters and stuff. Like I believe the opening piece, which uses Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, was very abstract. And some people were worried that maybe the animators were on drugs when they made it because they felt like it was a little psychedelic. But Fantasia, unfortunately, it doesn't get a lot of love from Disney fans, but a lot of people are familiar with this image of Mickey Mouse, and you probably are used to seeing him with a blue sorcerer's hat on, and that's because in this story, he is the sorcerer's apprentice. He is studying underneath this sorcerer or this wizard that you'll see here in a second, and he is doing the menial labor. Right now, he's transporting water from one well to another. And of course, he wants to do magic. It's not fun doing the work, to pay for your lessons, but he wants to do the magic. And here we have him working late at night. The wizard is doing a little bit of his magic. The wizard gets tired. He puts down his magical hat and goes to bed. And then Mickey picks it up and decides he's going to try some magic, and he gets himself in all kinds of shenanigans. But here, I'm going to play a little bit of it for you so that you can hear how the music ties into this. Now, keep in mind that back when this piece was originally written, there was no Disney cartoon to accompany it, but they would, in their programs, have the story, at least a general idea of the story, to read as they listen to the music. And we will see that themes are used in this. There are musical ideas to represent the sorcerer. There's musical ideas to represent the magic. And, of course, there's the famous theme that everybody knows from this, which goes bum 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 bum, and that's kind of like the main theme that represents the piece. But notice how the themes are used differently, how the orchestration changes, and whether it's played in major key, minor key, or whatnot, and that affects kind of the mood and helps tell the story. So here we have Mickey at the beginning, and he is watching the wizard get tired, and you'll notice the kind of magic theme that plays. And hopefully the apprentice has learned his lesson from that. So check out the rest of Fantasia. If you don't have Netflix, I'm not sure how else you can find it. You might be able to stream it or something like that from another service. But it's an excellent film. I'm sure you can find it on Blu-ray and DVD as well. But that's a great example of a tone poem, and one that is definitely accessible within pop culture due to Disney setting it to music in their film Fantasia. There's a few other examples here you can check out and look up for examples of that as well. And that leads us to our last type of programmatic music, and that's incidental music. Incidental music is basically the precursor to film music. It became kind of popular in the 1800s for plays and stage dramas and the like, to have music to accompany them. Now, of course, opera was doing this, beforehand, but unlike an opera in a play, they just act out their parts, and they, don't do a whole lot of singing. They don't have to sing every line like in the opera. So, of course, music can be used to enhance the action and story on a stage, just like it can in a video game or a TV show or a movie today. And there were some famous pieces of incidental music, as we call it. Probably one of the most famous was Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn composed, and I'm not sure why there's a hyphen in his name. That's maybe just a typo in the book. It's actually without the hyphen. But Mendelssohn actually composed an overture, if you will, a kind of prelude to a production of Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, when he was rather young. I believe he was still a teenager, and later on, the King of Prussia actually commissioned Mendelssohn to write more music for the play. Now, probably the most famous piece from this incidental music is the Wedding March from the story. And this piece of music actually was at one time a little controversial to be played in churches for weddings, because the story of A Midsummer Night's Dream, if you're familiar with it, is full of paganism. So it's a lot of pagan things like fairies and stuff like that, and enchanted spells and love potions and things like that. So it wasn't very popular with Catholic priests. But in the middle of the 1800s, there was a person of royalty in England who had a big wedding, and they were a big fan of Mendelssohn, so they actually end up using this wedding march from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And ever since the middle of the 1800s, this has been an extremely popular piece to play, usually on like a pipe organ, because rarely do you have a full orchestra available, as Mendelssohn originally wrote it to play at the end of a wedding. So usually on a piano or organ, you may hear this after they say, "And I now present you the bride and groom," or whatever. Let's see if you... So you may be familiar with that piece of music. That's actually a piece of incidental music from the Romantic period, where Mendelssohn composed for a Shakespeare play. Ironically, well, I don't know if it's ironic, but interestingly, it's also another famous piece of wedding music is from the Romantic period. The last chapter in the Romantic period is on Richard Wagner. I know it looks like Richard Wagner, but it's pronounced Richard Wagner. Is a German opera composer, and from one of his operas, there is also a particular piece of wedding music that's popular. It's called the Bridal Chorus. You probably know it as "Here Comes the Bride." Bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum. Now, that can, I guess, be considered incidental music because it's from an opera, but generally speaking, we kind of don't refer to operatic music as incidental music, so to speak. Although with Wagner's operas, sometimes you do hear people call them musical dramas. Wagner himself was not the biggest fan of calling his operas operas. Okay, so that pretty much does it for that particular chapter, and that leads us into the final thing that we're going to discuss, which is nationalism. Now, do not confuse nationalism with patriotism. Although nationalism may evoke a sense of patriotism, it's not quite the same thing, and we're going to address specifically nationalism in music. Like we said, there was a virtual dominance of music by German composers in the last period, the classical period, specifically from the Viennese school. And this kind of dominated the style of music, art music of the classical period. And you start to see in the 1800s an expression of individualism. People wanted to sound unique and didn't want to, kind of fall into the crux that Haydn fell into, because Haydn even reused some of his own music, and that was one of the critiques of the classical period, is that because it was so rooted in its philosophies and logic and reason, that it ended up being a little too predictable, and it was restricted emotionally and stuff like that. Plus, it didn't really express your own individualism, because it's like everybody was, banging their heads trying to sound like Beethoven or sound like Mozart, and the 1800s was a time where people were like, the heck with that, let's sound like, something unique and different. And so, as you can see here, nationalism led to a unification of lands such as Germany, Italy. A lot of the countries that we now know in Western Europe and Central Europe and even Eastern Europe were underneath kind of larger empires before the Romantic period, or even during some of the Romantic period. And once you started having smaller countries kind of develop from this, they started wanting to at least with their music and their art and stuff like that, develop a sense of nationalism. They wanted to have a national voice. They wanted Czechoslovakian music to sound unique from Polish music and Italian music. And there was no longer this kind of standard set by Italy and Germany and stuff like that. They wanted to have unique sounds, especially in nations that we really haven't seen a whole lot of representation from up to this point. This also explains why we have so many chapters dedicated to individual composers, because these composers are from Hungary, some are from like Austria and Germany and places like Mozart and Beethoven were from, but some of these are like Chopin are from Poland. We haven't talked about Poland yet much. Liszt is Hungarian. Mendelssohn, although he's German, his family's actually Jewish. Berlioz is French. Dvorak is, as well as Smetana, are Czechoslovakian. Tchaikovsky's Russian. Verdi and Puccini are Italian. Wagner's German. You see this kind of rich representation, and this is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. These are just kind of the cream of the crop guys here. And by the way, there used to be a chapter on Robert Schumann's wife, Clara Schumann. They kind of combined her in his chapter, and I think there was a lot of controversy with that. And I've already seen the new edition that's coming out of this textbook, and they've added back the chapter dedicated to Clara Schumann, and thank goodness, because I was pretty upset about that too. I have a lot of female students, and I imagine they get a little tired of hearing about this boys' game that's music up to this point. We haven't talked about females since old Hildegard of Bingen back in the Middle Ages, so it's nice that they've added the chapter back in the new edition for a female composer. But anyway, getting a little distracted there. Let's get back on nationalism. Nationalism is using a country, like say you're from Poland, you're going to use Polish dances, you're going to use Polish folk songs, you're going to do Polish legends if you're writing an opera or something like that. Like, you're going to use stuff that's unique to your country. We even see nationalism start to happen in America. Nationalism in America, like where American composers are being encouraged by European composers to look at some of the interesting musical developments in America. Things like Appalachian folk tunes, or even the beginnings of jazz, like things like, the blues and stuff like that, which would later definitely be adopted. I mean, look at Rhapsody in Blue, although that takes place in the 20th century. Rhapsody in Blue was commissioned by a guy named Paul Whiteman. He commissioned George Gershwin to use the blues and use jazz music as a basis to write a rhapsody, which is kind of a free form piece of music, and it was written for orchestra. Speaking of which, if you check out that Fantasia 2000, they do Rhapsody in Blue by Gershwin. So you will even see American composers adopt this nationalism and this nationalistic spirit in their music, albeit you do see them take a little bit longer to do it. Now, of course, the flip side of the coin of nationalism is exoticism, where composers would use a foreign land's culture in their music. And we're going to use a very famous ballet by Tchaikovsky called the Nutcracker. You may have even heard most of the music from the Nutcracker. We're going to be looking in the second act. It's a 2-act ballet. We're going to be looking in the second act, and I'm going to give you just a really quick, overly simple synopsis of what's happened in the story, just so you can get some context here. The Nutcracker basically is based on a fairy tale You have a young girl living with her, of course, her parents and stuff. She has a younger brother, and she's awaiting, Christmas. That's why you often see the Nutcracker performed around Christmas time and such. And it is Christmas, and she receives as a gift from one of her relatives this beautiful Nutcracker, which I'm sure you've all seen. They're usually kind of dressed like in military garb and stuff like that. And she instantly falls in love with it. She thinks it's extremely handsome, gorgeous. The craftsmanship was great. This is back when you could give kids things like a Nutcracker and they were just totally blown away by it. This is back before things had to have electricity and flowing through it to be impressive. But you have her totally enamored with this. Now her snotty little brother is not satisfied with his little 10 soldiers he gets and stuff. He thinks the Nutcracker is going to be the leader of his little army of soldiers, and he gets into kind of like a struggle over the Nutcracker, and it ends up breaking the Nutcracker, like breaks off his arm or something. And the young girl is devastated by this, but she tries to fix it best she can, and she goes to sleep that night, and she hears like a commotion downstairs, and she goes downstairs, and underneath the Christmas tree there's the mice and the rats fighting the toys and the gifts of Christmas. And she basically comes up and helps them, and she scares the mice away because they're kind of small. And by the way, here's a little fun fact in pop culture. Some of you may know who the rapper Tupac Shakur is. Tupac Shakur actually went to a fine arts high school, and in his fine arts production of the Nutcracker, he actually played the king of the rats. He played the Rat King and played that part. So had Tupac had continued with dance and went the ballet route instead of rapping and music, maybe he would still be alive today. Who knows? But the Rat King does cast a spell on the young girl before he is vanquished and retreats, and it shrinks her down to the size of the toys underneath the tree and everything. But through this, she's able to actually meet the Nutcracker, who's now her size. And of course, he's this no longer this stiff wooden toy. He's now come alive, and he's this dashing young looking military prince. And she, of course, is fallen instantly in love with him. And the various gifts of Christmas come out and do little dances to thank her for her assistance in defeating the mice. So here we have examples of exoticism, because you will notice that the various gifts are represented by nationalities, despite the fact that these are actual gifts. Now, the first gift that we're going to see here is actually chocolate. Now, this is often called the Spanish dance from it. Why Tchaikovsky would choose to do, and notice these aren't dressed like Hershey Kisses or anything. These aren't dressed like chocolate bars. These don't look anything like chocolate. They're dressed in like traditional Spanish garb, and you will hear here in a minute, Tchaikovsky does his best to evoke like the sound of Spanish folk music. He even used I believe it's castanets, to kind of give it that ethnic flavoring. So why use Spanish, kind of sounds and costumes and stuff to represent chocolate? Well, you have to remember Spain is the major, most of their colonies were over in South America, where the cocoa bean originally comes from. Like, Europeans didn't know what chocolate was until they started colonizing South America, and at one time Spain was the major importer of cocoa, which of course you need to make chocolate. So it makes sense to use Spain to represent chocolate. So I'm gonna let you watch and listen to the little Spanish dance here. We're going to play most of it, and then you're going to listen to the Exoticism, because again, Tchaikovsky's Russian and he's not from Spain. If he were a Spanish composer, this would be Nationalism. But this is kind of the flip side of the coin. Tchaikovsky's using a foreign country's culture, Spain in this case, to show Exoticism. So we're going to fast forward a little bit here to our next present, which is not Spain, not Arabia, but a place a little closer to Russia. Matter of fact, it kind of shares a very similar name. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding it here. Got a little too fast there. This country to represent. Believe it or not, this gift is to be candy canes. So candy canes are represented by the Russians. And of course, you know, candy canes are delicious. Why not save your own country to the most delicious of them all? Although I might argue that chocolate is superior to candy canes. But here we have the sweet peppermint candy canes come out, and they're represented by the Russian dance called the trepek, which actually is pronounced a little differently in Russian. Apparently it's pronounced somewhere like tropek or something like that, but it's often spelled T-R-E-P-A-K. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it is a Russian dance, and this is probably the most well-known piece of music from the Nutcracker. You have most certainly heard it before. So here is this wonderful, wonderful piece of music representing peppermint candy canes. So there you go. Very impressive dance. Very impressive piece of music by Tchaikovsky there. And again, he's using traditional, like, Russian, you know, like, and even exotic, you know, like folk themes. He's using, you know, even the costume designer for the ballet and stuff is calling upon the national identities here. And it's both a mix of nationalism, as we saw with the trepek there, as well as exoticism, as we saw with the Arabian dance, Spanish dance, and the Chinese dance. So the Nutcracker is an excellent example of this idea of nationalism as well as exoticism. Now, the particular piece of music that you do have that you will be assigned to listen to is a piece by Smetana, a Czechoslovakian composer, and it's called the Moldau. And the Moldau is from a collection of tone poems that he wrote about his own country, which is Czechoslovakia, obviously. And the Moldau is sort of like the main river. It dissects basically the western one-third of Czechoslovakia. And people in Czechoslovakia would know the Moldau, just like people here in America mostly know like where the Mississippi is, because it kind of dissects the eastern one-third of our country. So imagine you're going down this river and you're seeing the sights and sounds, experiencing the sights and sounds of Czechoslovakia. Some of them natural, like a peasant wedding and things like that, springs, you know, flowing down into the river, a forest hunt. And then some of them are fantastical, or I'm not even sure that's a real word. Some of them are dealing with the elements of the realm of fantasy and legend and things like that. Like you end up at this ancient mystical castle, you have these water nymphs doing this moonlight dance, and there's all these different things. And again, it's a tone poem. It's designed to kind of tell a story, so you'll read more about that. That is also an example of program music that involves a lot of nationalism, because pretty much everything involved in this story, even the river itself upon which the story takes place, is all from Czechoslovakia. So since he is a Czechoslovakian composer, that is nationalism. So that is a really good example there. And Smetana also does end up using some of the musical qualities found within Czechoslovakian folk music. And that's going to just about do it for these two chapters. Anything that I failed to cover in this recorded lecture will, of course, be included on your study guide that you have found on Blackboard. And you are welcome to, you know, look over the study guide, and if you have any questions, you can't find an answer that wasn't covered in this recorded lecture, or if you're one of my students that does have the seated class version and we didn't cover it in that class either, then feel free to contact me. I do try to cover almost all the bases there. So if you're someone who has stumbled across this YouTube video and you do want copies of all the study guides or whatever, you're free to email me. I'll try to remember to put my email address in the description of this video. And yeah, that just about does it. Next, we will be looking at the next section of the Romantic period. For part 3, we are going to start looking at some of these individual composers, starting with Franz Schubert. And so we will be taking a look at him. You may want to go ahead and kind of peruse over some of the other chapters that we have coming up. But thanks for watching as usual, and don't forget to utilize the study guide. Check out part 1 if you haven't checked out checked out part 1 of the Romantic period yet, as well as my other lecture videos on the other periods of music.